Wandering. When we think about wandering in the Bible, there are all sorts of stories that come to mind. The exile from the garden, the exile from Jerusalem, and in between, the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. We can think about the conquest narratives as a sort of wandering as people are entering a new land and a new space and trying to figure out how to live there and what to do about the people and the cultures that are already there. In the New Testament, we can think of all sorts of wandering as well. Jesus is wandering in the wilderness during the 40 days temptation. Even the way his ministry works is a sort of wandering as he goes from place to place. And certainly Paul's journeys have a sense of journey about them, and even a sort of wandering or a sense of not quite knowing how they're going to turn out with shipwrecks and imprisonments and the rest. But the wandering story that I want us to focus on today is Abraham's wandering. There is perhaps no more quintessential wanderer than Abraham. In fact, his story begins in chapter 12 of Genesis with God saying to Abram at this point, his name's not yet been changed, "Go from your country, your people, and from your father's household to the land I will show you." Can you imagine that? Abraham at this stage, he's an old guy. He's 75 years old. And God tells him, go, leave everything you know, the land that you know, your country, your people, your father's household. This is what we've been reading about in the stories of immigration and wandering we've looked at so far in this unit. We've thought about Adichie and Lahiri's stories of wandering and immigration. And this is the life that Abraham is being called to at this moment. And his wandering is not without trouble. He passes his wife off as his sister, and then he does the exact same thing later. He settles for a while with Lot, who's gone with him, but then they separate. He saves Lot, there are battles, he makes treaties with other kings, he wanders some more, he makes a covenant with God. He has one son by his wife's handmaid. 3 strange visitors come to see him while he's camping in one place. He tries to save Sodom and fails and has to flee. He passes his wife off as his sister again. It's a story marked by wandering, by mistakes, by missteps and fear and by trouble. I mean, when we think about Abraham wandering, it seems to me the stories I was given were often, Father Abraham having many sons. He only had 2, actually, but that's okay. Father Abraham, he had many sons. He was a great guy. He was this man of faith. He was called from his country and he faithfully went. Except we see a lot of other things happening in this story, right? They skip over the part in Sunday school about him prostituting his wife. Yeah, that's right. He actually prostitutes his wife. I said he passed his wife off as his sister. What actually happens first in chapter 12, it's like the very first thing he does when he's on the road. He ends up in Egypt because of a famine, and he's afraid because his wife Sarah is beautiful that the people might kill him in order to, have her for themselves. And so he tells her, hey, pretend you're my sister. And then he trades her as his sister to the Pharaoh in exchange for security and cows and land. I'm pretty sure when you trade a woman's body for material goods, it's called prostitution. So yeah, Abraham is pimping his wife. It's not really the Sunday school story. But it speaks to something important that's going on in these stories of wandering, and that's the sense of fear and insecurity, right? That's why Abraham does this. He doesn't do it for fun. He doesn't just do it to get rich. He does it because he's worried about his survival. He's worried about his wife's survival. And this seems to be the right way to go. And when he does it again with Abimelech, it's for the exact same reason in chapter 20. He's worried, he's insecure, and so he's willing to do things that seem really wrong and really problematic, and that I'd like to think he wouldn't have done in other circumstances. Because he's wandering, and it makes him afraid, and it makes him do stuff that's really questionable. We might say there's a similar thing going on with his son Ishmael as well. He's wandering, there have been promises made, but the promise of this new place isn't quite delivering. The promised son has not been born. So he, goes along with Sarah's plan and cuts some corners. Decides instead that Hagar's the right solution. It's interesting, isn't it, the ways in which the insecurity of wandering open up all sorts of opportunities in ourselves that we would have never expected. And sometimes those opportunities are amazing. Sometimes, like Abraham does in his battle where he rescues Lot and ends up treating with the king of Sodom, sometimes they're kind of heroic moments where you rush in and you save the day in ways you hadn't anticipated. But other times you find yourself doing things and making compromises when you're in a new situation and a new place and you don't know where you belong that you would have never done. What I find really fascinating throughout the Abraham narrative are the places where God seems to step in. Because when you think about it, like, Abraham is doing some really questionable things in some moments, especially around his wife. And so where is God in all of that? Where is God when Abraham is prostituting Sarah? Where is God when he uses Hagar to try to bring about a promise, to try to make good on the promise that this wandering was supposed to deliver? Well, it's interesting because we start to see that God does intervene in some key moments. Yes, he has conversations with Abraham around the covenant, but we see God kind of like overstepping his godly separation from the story to punish Pharaoh, making Pharaoh then aware of the fact that he's actually with another man's wife, giving Abimelech a dream, again, intervening on Sarah's behalf. We see God stepping in to save Hagar twice. Once when she first falls pregnant and is sent away from the camp, and the second time when she's exiled with Ishmael. We start to see this pattern emerging that when people are vulnerable, like really vulnerable, like in these moments of real impossibility, God sometimes steps in, sometimes intercedes, and stops it. And I find this really fascinating because one of the other places in this story where we see God like really actively intervening actually is in Sodom and Gomorrah. And this is an archetype that is used in all sorts of really problematic and really damaging and hurtful ways in our culture. But in the story, these angelic visitors come to tell Lot and his family that the city is going to be destroyed. And remember, Abraham's already argued with God. Abraham has tried his hardest to argue God out of his plan to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And God doesn't get mad at him. He doesn't tell him, no, I know what I'm doing. Who are you to ask me these questions? He actually seems to encourage Abraham's argument and says, okay, find me 100 righteous. And Abraham's like, I can't actually. Okay, how about 50? And they get down to 10, and Abraham still can't find 10 righteous people. But through that whole dialogue, through that whole arguing with God, there's never a sense that Abraham's doing the wrong thing. And then God sends the messengers to Lot's family, and people in the town come to rape the visitors. And Lot, again, in a moment that you'd like to think Lot would do better under other circumstances if he didn't feel the threat of being a foreigner in this town and the threat that wandering has opened up. In this moment when the townspeople come to rape the visitors, Lot offers his daughters instead. And what do these messengers from God do in that moment? They pull the daughters back inside and keep them safe and smack all the people, blind them so they can't do anything to the daughters. So where do we see God in this story? I find it amazing. We see God stepping in time and again on behalf of those who are most vulnerable, specifically on the behalf of women who are in absolutely no-win situations where they have no choice and no opportunities. When we're wandering, it can be really hard. There are all sorts of promises that are offered in journeys. And as we saw in the arrangers of marriage, a lot of times those promises are not at all what they were meant to be. And as we see in this story here, a lot of times in those moments when the promises aren't being realized in the way we thought they should be, people make really horrible decisions. And yet it's in these moments where things aren't the way they're supposed to be, where dislocation is wrecking its most painful damage on people in stories, where people are making choices that seem to be bringing out their worst selves because of their insecurity and because of their fear. It's in these moments that God shows up in this story. And so as you're reading through Abraham's story, I want you to think about the stories of wandering we've been reading. How do they help you to maybe understand Abraham's character and the choices he's making, the good ones and the bad ones, and maybe help humanize some of those bad choices as well as those good choices? What do you make of Sarah? How do you see her differently, thinking about some of the characters we've encountered in these short stories? And maybe most importantly, in your own wandering, where have you seen yourself disappointed in what's materialized, disappointed in the choices you've made? And maybe where in those darkest moments have you seen God show up in unexpected and really powerful ways?